The moment Christian saw the blue-skinned woman desperately clutching her terrified daughter while six armed mercenaries closed in for the kill, he knew his quiet life was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. What he didn't know was that saving them would transform him from a solitary drifter into the unlikely protector of an entire civilization, or that the woman's whispered offer in the darkness of their escape would bind their fates together in ways that would reshape the future of multiple worlds. Sometimes survival means standing still and fighting, and this was one of those times. Beneath the colossal glass dome of planet Orella, among the clamor of 1,000 voices haggling in a dozen languages, the sense of exotic food wafting from vendor stalls, and the colorful chaos of species from across the sector mingling in uneasy commerce. A man in a worn leather jacket wandered through the crowds like a predator moving through tall grass. Christian had learned long ago how to blend into any environment, how to become just another face in the multitude, while his sharp eyes cataloged exits, threats, and opportunities with the unconscious precision of someone who had survived in places where mistakes meant death. His disheveled dark hair and careless appearance, the stubble on his jaw, and the faded patches on his jacket, all served to mask the coiled strength in his frame and the predatory awareness in his pale gray eyes. He moved with the deceptive ease of someone completely relaxed, but those who knew how to read body language would have seen the truth in the way his weight stayed balanced, always ready to explode into motion, in the way his hands never strayed far from the weapons concealed beneath his jacket, in the constant micro-adjustments of his path that kept him clear of potential traps and choke points. The marketplace sprawled beneath the dome like a living organism, pulsing with energy and desperation in equal measure. Orella had once been a prosperous world, known throughout the sector for its advanced biotechnology and its people's gift for diplomacy and ecological restoration. But that was before the Helix Consortium had arrived with their warships and their cold calculations about profit and control. Now the planet was occupied territory, its native population reduced to second-class citizens in their own cities, and the marketplace reflected that harsh new reality with the presence of armed patrols and the undercurrent of fear that flavored every transaction. Christian had come to Orella for a simple reason. He needed supplies, and the planet's black market was known for asking few questions. He'd been planning to purchase food, ammunition, and some replacement parts for his aging ship, then leave before he got tangled in local politics. He'd survived this long by following a simple rule. Other people's problems stayed other people's problems. Getting involved meant complications, and complications got you killed. But sometimes the universe has other plans. His attention was caught by a commotion near the textile stalls, where colorful fabrics from a dozen worlds hung like waterfalls of silk and synthetic fibers. A group of mercenaries in the dark gray uniforms of Helix Private Security were shoving through the crowd with the casual brutality of those who knew no one would challenge them. People scattered before them like fish before a shark, and in their wake, Christians saw what they were hunting. A young woman with the distinctive blue skin of Orella's native population was running, her movements hampered by the small child she held pressed against her chest. The woman, Baronini, had the high cheekbones and elegant features that spoke of good breeding. And despite her obvious terror, there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she had once commanded respect rather than fled in panic. Her clothes, though torn and stained, had once been fine, the kind of garments worn by the diplomatic caste that had once guided Orella's complex web of interplanetary relationships. The child in her arms, Aliciama, could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old by human reckoning, though Christian knew little about the development rates of her species. The girl's small face was pressed into her mother's shoulder, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Baronini's torn robe with the desperate strength of absolute terror. Her eyes, when they briefly met Christian's across the chaos of the marketplace, were far too old for such a young face, carrying the haunted look of someone who had seen things no child should ever witness. The mercenaries were closing in with the systematic efficiency of trained hunters, cutting off their prey's escape routes. Christian counted 6 of them, all armed with energy weapons that would leave nothing but ash if they fired in the crowded marketplace. Their leader, a scarred human with the dead eyes of a career killer, was already raising his weapon as Baronini stumbled on the uneven pavement, nearly falling. Christian found his feet carrying him forward before his brain had consciously made the decision to intervene. His body remembered the training that had been beaten into him in the criminal territories of Argon, where he'd grown from a terrified child into a survivor who understood that sometimes the only way to stay alive was to move first and think later. One of the mercenaries, noticing Christian's trajectory would intersect their pursuit, turned and barked out a warning in the harsh trade dialect that served as a common language in this part of the sector. "Move aside, citizen. This is consortium business and doesn't concern you." Christian slowed his pace but didn't stop, his hands visible and open in a gesture of apparent compliance. His voice when he spoke was casual, almost bored, the tone of someone commenting on the weather rather than facing down armed killers. "Maybe it doesn't concern me, friend, but you're making so much noise you're disturbing my shopping. I was trying to buy dinner, and now you've got the whole market in an uproar. Bad for business, you know." The mercenaries laughed, harsh sounds that carried no real humor. They were used to fear, used to compliance, used to the occupied population melting away before them like snow before fire. The idea that someone might actually object to their actions seemed to strike them as absurdly funny. The scarred leader took a step toward Christian, his weapon lowering slightly as he sized up this unexpected obstacle. He saw a single man, apparently unarmed, with the worn look of a drifter or traitor, someone insignificant. He made the fatal mistake of judging Christian's threat level by his appearance rather than the cold calculation in his eyes. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away," the leader said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never met real resistance. "Turn around, go about your business, and pretend you didn't see anything. Or stay, and we add you to the cleanup list. Your choice." Christian's eyes flicked past the leader to where Berenini had frozen, her back against a wall, Elysiama trembling in her arms. The child's face had emerged from her mother's shoulder, and those two old eyes were locked on Christian with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if she both wanted him to help and knew from bitter experience that no help would come. That look decided it. Christian began counting aloud, his voice quiet and almost conversational, each number dropping into the sudden silence like stones into still water. 3. The mercenaries exchanged confused glances, not understanding what was happening. 2. The leader's weapon started to come back up, instinct finally overriding confidence as he recognized something in Christian's body language that screamed danger. 1. Christian moved. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking, from apparent relaxation to explosive violence in the space between heartbeats. His right hand whipped forward, and suddenly there was a knife in it, the blade catching light as it spun through the air and buried itself in the leader's throat with a meaty thunk that cut off his warning shout before it could form. The man dropped, hands clawing uselessly at the blade, blood spraying in arterial pulses across the pavement. Christian was already moving, closing the distance to the second mercenary before the man's brain could process what had just happened to his commander. An elbow strike to the temple dropped him like a puppet with cut strings, his weapon clattering away unfired. The third mercenary got his weapon up and managed to pull the trigger, but Christian had already pivoted, using the falling body of the second mercenary as a shield. The energy bolt intended for Christian's chest instead vaporized the already unconscious man, and Christian used the moment of horror and hesitation this created to close the distance and drive his fist into the shooter's solar plexus with enough force to crack ribs and collapse a lung. The remaining 3 mercenaries finally managed to coordinate a response, but by then Christian had acquired one of the dropped weapons, and the dynamics had shifted. He fired 3 times with the cold precision of someone who had learned to shoot in places where ammunition was precious and every shot had to count. 3 bodies hit the ground, not even managing to cry out. Neat holes burned through their heads before they could process the threat. The entire fight had taken perhaps 15 seconds from Christian's first movement to the last mercenary falling. The marketplace around them had gone silent, hundreds of eyes staring in shock at the carnage that had erupted so suddenly in their midst. Then someone screamed and the crowd began to surge away in panic, and Christian knew they had maybe 2 minutes before security forces descended on this location in overwhelming numbers. He crossed to where Berenini stood frozen against the wall, Elysiama still clutched in her arms. Up close, he could see the fine tremors running through both their bodies, the shock that came after the adrenaline of flight wore off. Berenini's eyes were wide as she stared at him, trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed with the casual way Christian was already checking the bodies for useful items and wiping his knife clean on a dead mercenary's uniform. "You need to move," Christian said, his voice urgent but not unkind. "More will come, and when they do, you don't want to be anywhere near here." Berenini found her voice, though it came out rough and shaking. "Why did you help us? You don't know us. You don't know what we're running from. You could have walked away." Christian retrieved his knife and the weapon he'd appropriated, checking its charge level with practiced efficiency. "I could have," he agreed, "but I didn't. Now stop wasting time asking stupid questions and start moving. Unless you want your kid to see what happens when a full security team shows up." The mention of Aliciama seemed to snap Berenini out of her shock. She adjusted her grip on her daughter and started to move, following Christian as he navigated through the panicking crowd with the sure instinct of someone who had spent his life finding paths through chaos. Behind them, alarms began to wail, the distinctive sound of Helix security alerts that meant lockdown was coming. Christian cursed under his breath and picked up the pace, guiding Berenini through a service entrance that most people didn't even notice. Down a maintenance corridor that smelled of recycled air and old grease, through a maze of passages that suggested he'd done his homework on Aurella's infrastructure before ever setting foot in the marketplace. "Where are we going?" Berenini gasped, struggling to keep up while carrying Aliciama. "My ship," Christian replied tersely. "If we can get there before they lock down the docking." Bays. They emerged into a cargo handling area, and Christian immediately held up a hand for silence. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, security forces coordinating their search pattern. Christian pressed back into the shadows, pulling Berenini and Aliciama with him, and they waited with held breath as a patrol passed within meters of their hiding spot. When the patrol moved on, Christian led them on a different route, constantly adapting to the changing tactical situation. They moved through a water treatment facility where the sound of pumps covered their footsteps, across a maintenance gantry that swayed sickeningly over a waste processing pit, through what appeared to be some kind of illegal gambling den, where the patrons were too focused on their games to notice 3 fugitives passing through. Finally, they reached the old docking yards where ships that had seen better days waited for crews desperate or poor enough to fly them. Christian's ship, the Sierra, sat in a berth that looked like it hadn't been used in years, surrounded by rusting equipment and abandoned cargo containers. The ship itself was a battered freighter that appeared to have survived several wars and at least one catastrophic collision, her hull plates mismatched and welded with more enthusiasm than skill. Her engine housings jury-rigged with parts that probably hadn't been meant for that model in the first place. Berenini stared at the ship with undisguised dismay. "This is your ship? This thing looks like it should be in a scrapyard, not flying." Christian was already running toward the loading ramp, his head on a swivel as he watched for pursuit. "She's not pretty, but she's reliable. Well, mostly reliable. Reliable enough to get us out of here, which is all that matters right now." That's not exactly reassuring. You want reassurance? Hire a luxury liner. You want to survive the next 10 minutes? Shut up and get inside. Behind them, shouts erupted as security forces finally spotted them. Energy bolts began to sizzle through the air, scorching the pavement around their feet. Christian practically threw Berenini and Aliciama up the loading ramp, then followed, slapping the door control as he passed. The ramp began to rise with agonizing slowness, and Christian added his strength to the mechanism, hauling it closed manually while bolts hammered against the outer hull. Inside, the ship smelled of recycled air, machine oil, and something that might have been burnt wiring. The interior was as patched and improvised as the exterior, but there was an underlying sense of order to the chaos, as if someone who knew ships intimately had done the best they could with limited resources. Christian vaulted into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence with the kind of frantic efficiency that suggested he'd done emergency launches before. The Sierra's engines groaned, coughed, and for one heart-stopping moment, Christian thought they might not catch. Then they roared too, life with a sound like an angry dragon, and the ship began to shudder as power flooded through her systems. "Strap in," Christian ordered, not looking back. "This is going to be rough." Berenini managed to secure herself and Aliciama in the co-pilot's seat. the safety harness barely managing to accommodate both of them. Through the viewport, she could see patrol ships beginning to scramble, their engines lighting up as they prepared to intercept. Christian's hands flew over the controls with practiced precision, overriding safety protocols and pushing the engines beyond their recommended tolerances. The Sierra lurched upward, her landing gear barely retracting, before they scraped against the docking clamps. Metal shrieked against metal, sparks flew, and then they were free and climbing fast toward the atmospheric boundary. A patrol ship appeared on their tail, weapons charging. Warning lights blazed across Christian's console, and the ship's automated systems began screaming alerts about targeting locks and imminent weapons fire. Christian watched the tactical display with apparent calm, waiting, timing, and then at the last possible moment he cut the main engines completely. The Sierra dropped like a stone. The patrol ship, committed to its attack run and moving far faster, overshot them by 100 meters. Christian reignited the engines at full burn and angled away from the pursuit vector, using the momentary confusion to put distance between them and their pursuers. "They're coming back around," Baronini shouted over the noise of the straining engines. "I know," Christian replied, his voice tight with concentration. "Hold on." He pushed the Sierra into a steep climb that made the superstructure groan in protest, threading between two massive orbital platforms with barely meters to spare on either side. The patrol ship tried to follow, but their pilot wasn't willing to risk the same maneuver. And by the time they'd found a safe route through, Christian had the Sierra's jump drive spooling up. The stars stretched and blurred as they punched through into hyperspace, and suddenly the chaos and noise fell away, replaced by the eerie silence of faster-than-light travel. Christian sagged in his seat, allowing himself a moment of relief now that immediate danger had passed. In the sudden quiet, Alicia's soft crying became audible. The girl was shaking, pressing her face back into her mother's shoulder, and Baronini was whispering to her in their native language, words that sounded like comfort and apology woven together. Her own hands were trembling where they stroked her daughter's hair, and there were tears tracking down her blue-tinged cheeks. Christian looked away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion and the intimacy of the moment. He busied himself with checking the ship's systems, cataloging the damage from their hasty departure, and calculating how long they could stay in hyperspace before they'd need to drop out for repairs or refueling. The news wasn't great, but it could have been worse. They had maybe 3 days of travel before critical systems would start failing. After a while, when Aliciama's sobs had quieted to occasional hiccups, and Baronini seemed to have regained some measure of composure, Christian spoke without turning around. "You going to tell me what that was about? Why the consortium wants you dead badly enough to send a kill squad into a public marketplace?" Baronini was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of grief and exhaustion. "Because I'm one of the last survivors of my people's diplomatic dynasty. Because when Helix invaded Arella, they offered the ruling families a choice: collaborate and live in comfortable captivity, or resist and die. Most chose survival. My husband chose defiance." Her voice broke slightly on the word husband, and Christian heard the fresh pain there. He was a soldier in the resistance, coordinating attacks against consortium supply lines and occupation forces. They caught him 3 months ago, tortured him for information he didn't have, then executed him publicly as an example. They wanted me to attend, to watch, to break me. Instead, I escaped with Aliciama, and we've been running ever since. "And they're hunting you because? Because alive, I represent the possibility that resistance can succeed. Because my family's name still carries weight among the refugee populations scattered across this sector. Because every day I survive is a reminder that the consortium doesn't have absolute control. They need to make an example of me, to prove that defiance leads only to death." Christian absorbed this information, recognizing the strategic logic even as he found it distasteful. Symbols mattered, especially in occupied territories where hope was the most dangerous weapon the resistance possessed. "So where are we going? Because I'm guessing you didn't just run blind." "There's a colony on the edge of the Verge systems. Kalos Station, they call it. A place where refugees go when they have nowhere else. My husband spoke of it before he died, said if anything happened to him, I should take Aliciama and run there. He said it was far enough from the core systems that the consortium didn't consider it worth the resources to control, but established enough that we might find safety. Might being the operative word, Christian muttered. And if this colony doesn't exist anymore, or if they won't take you, then we'll find somewhere else, or we'll die trying, but at least we'll die free. There was steel in her voice despite the exhaustion, a core of determination that Christian recognized because he saw the same thing when he looked in a mirror. Survivors had a certain quality to them, a refusal to simply give up and die that transcended logic or reason. Aliciama had fallen asleep against her mother's chest, exhausted by fear and adrenaline. In sleep, she looked even younger and more vulnerable, her small chest rising and falling with the deep rhythms of childhood rest. Baronini held her with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had already lost too much and would die before losing more. Christian stood, stretching muscles that ached from tension and violence. There's a cabin in the back. Not fancy, just a couple of bunks and a wash station that works most of the time, but it's private. Get some rest. We've got a long trip ahead, and you both need sleep. Baronini looked like she might argue, but exhaustion won out over pride. She carefully stood, supporting Aliciama's weight, and followed Christian through the narrow corridor to the rear cabin. It was indeed basic, barely large enough for the two bunks bolted to opposite walls, a small storage locker, and the promised wash station, which looked like it had been salvaged from 3 different ships and cobbled together with hopeful optimism. "Thank you," Baronini said quietly, settling Aliciama on one of the bunks and pulling a thin blanket over her. "For helping us, for risking your life when you didn't have to." Christian shrugged uncomfortably, already turning toward the door. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. We're just less immediately dead. Get some rest. I'll wake you if anything happens." He returned to the cockpit and settled into the pilot's seat, his body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the various aches and pains from the fight. His knuckles were split from the punch that had broken the mercenary's ribs. His shoulder throbbed from where he'd used it to ram someone during the close combat, and he could feel the beginning of a spectacular bruise forming along his ribs where someone had gotten in a lucky hit before going down. None of it was serious, just the accumulated cost of violence that he was intimately familiar with. He'd carry these aches for a few days and then they'd fade, replaced by the next batch from whatever trouble he stumbled into next. That was the rhythm of his life, had been for as long as he could remember. Except now he wasn't alone anymore, and that thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He'd spent years deliberately avoiding attachments, keeping his relationships transactional and temporary, never staying in one place long enough for bonds to form. It was safer that way, cleaner. When you cared about nothing and no one, the universe had no leverage against you. But he'd looked into Aliciama's terrified eyes and all his careful rules had evaporated like morning mist. Now he had 2 refugees depending on him, looking to him for protection and guidance, and he had no idea what he was doing or why he'd committed to this course of action. The ship hummed around him, the familiar sounds of an aging vessel held together by skill and stubbornness. Christian let his mind drift, not quite sleeping, but not fully alert either, the restful half-state of someone who had learned to grab rest whenever and wherever it was available. Hours passed. The Sierra flew on through hyperspace, carrying them away from Arela and toward an uncertain future. Christian checked their course occasionally, making minor adjustments to account for drift and the peculiarities of his navigation system. But mostly he just sat and thought about how his life had just gotten immeasurably more complicated. When Baronini emerged from the cabin 8 hours later, she looked marginally better. She'd washed her face and changed into a spare jumpsuit she'd found in the cabin's storage locker, something that had probably belonged to Christian at some point and hung loose on her slender frame. Her movements were still cautious, as if she expected danger to manifest at any moment, but there was more strength in her bearing. "Aliciama's still sleeping," she reported, taking the co-pilot's seat without asking permission. "She barely stirred when I got up." "Good. She needs it. You both do." They sat in silence for a while, watching the strange non-light of hyperspace flow past the viewport. Finally, Baronini spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You're very good at violence. That fight in the marketplace, I've seen trained soldiers who weren't as efficient as you were. Where did you learn to fight like that? Christian was quiet for a moment, debating how much to share. Then he shrugged, figuring she'd earned at least some truth after what they'd been through. Argon sector, the criminal territories in the Outer Rim. You don't grow up there, you survive there, and the ones who make it to adulthood are the ones who learn to be harder and meaner than everything trying to kill them. That's where you're from? The crime worlds? Born there, raised there, barely escaped there. My mother was a docking technician who made some bad choices and ended up in debt to the wrong people. I was the collateral, spent my childhood doing whatever jobs the gangs needed, learning to steal and fight and disappear when things got hot. By the time I was 12, I'd killed 3 people in self-defense. By 15, that number was in double digits. He said it flatly, without emotion, stating facts rather than seeking sympathy or absolution. At 16, I managed to stow away on a cargo ship heading out of sector. Spent the next 10 years drifting, taking whatever work I could find, building up enough credits to buy the Sierra. Been flying solo ever since, staying out of trouble and keeping my head down. Until today, Baronini observed. Until today, Christian agreed. Why? Why help us when everything in your history says you should have walked away? Christian thought about Elysiama's eyes, about the resignation in them that said she'd already learned not to expect help from adults. He thought about his own childhood, about being small and scared and alone while the universe ground forward without caring whether he lived or died. Because nobody helped me when I was her age, he said finally, and I remember what that felt like. Baronini reached out and placed her hand over his on the armrest, the touch light but deliberate. Christian tensed, unused to casual physical contact, but he didn't pull away. Then we're lucky you remembered, she said softly. The alarm that interrupted the moment was harsh and insistent, the ship's automated systems detecting an anomaly in their hyperspace trajectory. Christian was instantly focused, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to identify the problem. What is it? Baronini asked, tension flooding back into her voice. Someone's forcing us out of hyperspace, Christian said grimly. There's only one way to do that, with a gravitational interdictor field. Military hardware, expensive as hell, which means whoever's out there isn't some random pirate. Hell-X found us, Baronini breathed. How? Tracking device on one of us, maybe. Or they predicted our destination and set up checkpoints along the likely routes. Doesn't matter how right now. What matters is we're about to have company and we're not equipped to fight them. The Sierra shuddered and lurched as it dropped back into normal space, the violent transition making loose items rattle around the cockpit. Christian's screens immediately began painting targets, and what he saw made his stomach sink. A Hell-X patrol cruiser, 10 times the Sierra's mass and bristling with weapons, hung in space ahead of them. Its targeting systems were already locked on, weapons charged and ready to fire. They were completely outmatched. Christian's mind raced through options, discarding them as fast as they formed. They couldn't outrun a military vessel. They couldn't fight it. They couldn't jump back to hyperspace until the drive recharged, which would take at least 5 minutes they didn't have. So he did the only thing left. He played dead. His hands moved with desperate speed, shutting down all non-essential systems. He vented atmosphere from the port side, creating the visual effect of a hull breach. He cut the engines and let the Sierra drift, powering down everything except life support and the passive sensors he'd need to monitor the cruiser's response. What are you doing? Baronini hissed. Playing dead. If they think we're crippled, maybe they'll come in close to board instead of just blowing us apart. If they board, we might have a chance. That's a terrible plan. You got a better one? Baronini was silent, which was answer enough. The patrol cruiser circled them like a shark around wounded prey, its sensors probing the Sierra's hull for signs of life. Christian held his breath, willing the ship to seem as dead as possible, hoping the commander over there was cautious enough to want prisoners and intelligence rather than just a debris field. Long minutes crawled past. Elysiama appeared in the cockpit doorway, awakened by the alarm, her eyes wide with fresh fear. Baronini gestured for her to stay silent, and the girl obeyed with the discipline of someone who had already learned that noise at the wrong time meant death. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the cruiser began to move away. Not retreating exactly, but continuing its patrol pattern, apparently satisfied that the Sierra was either destroyed or too damaged to be a threat. Christian waited until the cruiser was out of sensor range, counting his heartbeats and forcing himself not to rush. Then, with aching slowness, he began bringing systems back online. The engines started with barely a whisper, their sound dampened by the modifications Christian had made for exactly situations like this, where stealth mattered more than power. "That was insane," Baranini said once they were moving again, limping away from the intercept point at a fraction of their normal speed. "That was necessary," Christian corrected. "But we've got a problem now. They're hunting us, which means they either tracked us somehow or they're covering all the likely routes to refugee colonies. Either way, we can't just make a straight run for Kalos. Then what do we do?" Christian pulled up a star chart, studying the options. His finger stabbed at a point in empty space between major systems. "There. Old mining station, abandoned years ago when the veins played out. It's off the main routes, not worth the resources to demolish, so it just sits there. We can hole up, do repairs, figure out our next move. And if someone else had the same idea, if it's occupied by pirates or squatters, then we deal with that when we get there. Right now, it's the best option we've got." The journey to the abandoned station took another day of careful navigation, avoiding the major travel lanes and jumping through systems so remote they barely registered on standard charts. Christian pushed the Sierra as hard as he dared, but the damage from their hasty escape and the forced interdiction was accumulating, and he could hear whirring sounds coming from the engine section that suggested something was close to failing. The station, designated Reaver 9 on the old mining charts, appeared on their sensors as a dead hulk tumbling slowly through space. Its lights were dark, its transponder silent, its docking ports twisted and warped by some ancient impact or disaster. But one bay still showed green on the Sierra's sensors, and Christian guided them toward it with the careful precision of someone coaxing a dying ship through one last maneuver. The docking clamps engaged with a grinding shriek of metal on metal, and Christian winced at the sound. They were committed now, for better or worse. He powered down the Sierra's systems to minimal levels, conserving what power remained, and stood to face his passengers. "We're here. Let's find out what we're dealing with." They suited up in emergency gear, not trusting that the station's atmosphere would still be breathable after years of abandonment, and cycled through the airlock into the station itself. The interior was a tomb, silent and dark except for the occasional flicker of emergency lighting that suggested some systems still had residual power. Dust covered every surface in a thick layer, and their boots left clear prints in it, the first marks in what was probably years. The air, when Christian cautiously cracked his helmet seal and sniffed, was stale and tasted of recycled metal and old fear, but it was breathable. He gestured for the others to open their helmets as well, and they proceeded deeper into the station, with weapons drawn and senses alert for any sign of habitation or danger. What they found was evidence of a hasty evacuation, personal items abandoned mid-use, meals half-eaten and long since decayed to dust, computers still displaying data that had been rendered obsolete by years of drift, and on the walls scorch marks that spoke of weapon fire and violence. "Something bad happened here," Baranini said quietly, running her fingers along the burn marks. "Yeah," Christian agreed. "But whatever it was, it's long over. Place is dead." They made their way to what had been the station's operations center, a large chamber with viewports looking out at the stars and banks of dormant computer terminals. Christian set his pack down and began exploring, looking for anything useful. Baranini took Aliciama on a different route, searching the station's storage sections for supplies. They returned an hour later with surprisingly good news. "Emergency rations, still sealed," Baranini reported, showing Christian the packages. "Water recyclers that might be coaxed back to life. Even some medical supplies that look usable." "Whoever left here didn't take everything," Christian observed. "They left in a hurry," Baranini said. "Probably didn't have time or capacity to grab everything. Our good fortune, I suppose." They set up a temporary camp in the operations center, using emergency lights and a portable heater Christian had brought from the Sierra to create a small island of warmth and light in the dead station. Aliciama was clearly frightened by the dark and empty corridors, but she tried to be brave, helping her mother sort through the supplies and organize their temporary home. That night, as they sat around the heater eating reconstituted rations that tasted like cardboard but filled their stomachs, Christian found himself actually relaxing slightly for the first time since the marketplace. They were safe here, at least temporarily. No one knew where they were, and the station's dead systems meant they were invisible to any sensors that might be scanning this region of space. Aliciama had finally allowed herself to be a child again, chattering quietly to her mother about the strange station and asking questions about where they were going next. Berenini answered patiently, her love for her daughter evident in every word and gesture. Watching them, Christian felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name, but that felt suspiciously like longing. After Aliciama fell asleep, curled up on a makeshift bed of cargo blankets with exhaustion written into every line of her small body, Berenini moved closer to where Christian sat checking his weapons and equipment. "Tell me about your ship," she said quietly. "The Sierra. How did you come by her?" Christian looked up from the energy weapon he was cleaning, surprised by the question. "Won her in a card game, believe it or not. Previous owner was a smuggler who got in over his head with the local syndicate, needed to disappear fast and was willing to trade his ship for enough credits to start over somewhere else. She was a wreck even then, but I saw potential. Spent 5 years fixing her up, learning her quirks, making her mine." "You love that ship," Berenini observed. "I can hear it in your voice when you talk about her." "She's kept me alive more times than I can count," Christian said. "She's not fast and she's not pretty, but she's reliable and she's mine. That counts for something." "I had a home once," Berenini said softly. "A real home, not just a place to sleep. Gardens that my husband tended, rooms filled with books and art, windows that looked out over the silver forests of Arella. We were building a life there, Christian. Building a future for Aliciama, planning to have more children, to grow old together, watching our grandchildren play in those gardens." Her voice broke, and she paused to regain control. "Then Helix came, and in one day everything ended. My home burned. My husband died. My future turned to ash. Now all I have is Aliciama, and the clothes on our backs, and the desperate hope that somewhere out there is a place we can stop running." Christian set down his weapon and looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the blue skin and the exotic features to the human emotion underneath. Pain, loss, exhaustion, but also determination and hope, fragile but refusing to die. "You'll find it," he said, not sure if he believed it, but wanting to offer comfort anyway. "That place, that safety. You'll find it, and you'll build a new life, and Aliciama will grow up strong and brave like her mother." "Will you be there?" Berenini asked, and the question hung between them like something physical. "When we find that place, will you stay? Or will you go back to drifting alone through the galaxy?" Christian didn't have an answer. He'd spent so long avoiding exactly that question, avoiding the possibility of permanence and attachment, that he didn't know how to even begin formulating a response. Before he could try, the station's sensors bleeped urgently. Christian was on his feet instantly, crossing to the operations console and pulling up the display. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Company," he said grimly. "3 ships, Goldrin Division markings." Berenini's face went pale, and when she spoke, her voice carried absolute terror. "Goldrin! Christian, those aren't just regular Helix forces. They're elite hunters, specialists in tracking down high-value targets. They don't give up. They don't stop. They don't fail. If they're here, it means someone important wants me dead badly enough to authorize the best." "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe. They'll already be scanning the station, looking for power signatures or life signs. When they find us, and they will find us, they'll come through fast and hard." Christian was already moving, grabbing gear and weapons. "Wake Aliciama. We need to move now." They raced through the dark corridors toward the Sierra, Christian in the lead with his weapon ready, Berenini carrying a frightened Aliciama, both of them stumbling in the uncertain light. Behind them, the sound of cutting charges burning through the station's hull echoed through the empty spaces, the hunters not bothering with subtlety now that they knew their prey was trapped. Christian had the Sierra's engines hot before they had even finished climbing aboard, overriding safety protocols and pushing the ship to start faster than she was designed to. The engines caught with a roar that shook the whole vessel, and he didn't wait for proper warm-up or system checks before punching the emergency release on the docking clamps. The clamps, old and poorly maintained, didn't want to let go. Christian added the ship's maneuvering thrusters to the equation, wrenching the Sierra free with brute force that left chunks of metal and circuitry behind. They tore out of the docking bay just as the hunters breached into the station behind them, energy weapons firing, one bolt clipping the Sierra's aft shield and sending alarms shrieking. Christian didn't try to fight. The Sierra wasn't a warship, and the Goldrun ships were specifically designed for combat and pursuit. Instead, he dove toward the nearby asteroid field, the same one that had probably destroyed the mining station's profitability all those years ago, and began threading the freighter between rocks that could pulverize them if he miscalculated by even a meter. The Goldrun ships followed, their superior maneuverability allowing them to match the Sierra's desperate weaving through the asteroids. One ship got too aggressive, clipping a rock and going into an uncontrolled spin that sent it smashing into a larger asteroid with a flash of light and debris. But the other two pressed on, professional and relentless. Christian's hands moved over the controls with desperate precision, calling on every bit of skill he'd accumulated in years of flying through dangerous space. He found a narrow canyon between two massive asteroids, barely wide enough for the Sierra to fit through, and shot into it without hesitation. The hull scraped both sides, leaving paint and metal behind, but they made it through. The Goldrun ships had to go around, their larger size making the direct route impossible. By the time they'd found an alternate path, Christian had the Sierra deep in the asteroid field's densest region, weaving between rocks and using the sensor interference to break target. Locks. "We lost them," Baronini said after 20 tense minutes of silent flying. "For now," Christian agreed, not relaxing his vigilance. "But they know we're out here. We need to get to Kalos, fast, before they can set up another interdiction net." The journey to Kalos took 3 more days of careful navigation, avoiding the major routes and jumping through systems so obscure they didn't even have names on Christian's charts. He pushed the Sierra hard, knowing that every moment they delayed gave the hunters time to predict their destination and prepare another trap. The ship was suffering from the abuse. Strange sounds emanated from the engine section, and Christian spent hours in the cramped engineering spaces with tools and patches, coaxing the failing systems into holding together just a little longer. Baronini helped where she could, following his terse instructions and learning on the fly about starship systems and emergency repairs. Aliciama, remarkably, seemed to be adapting. The constant danger in flight had become her new normal, and she'd developed a kind of quiet resilience that broke Christian's heart even as it impressed him. She would sit in the co-pilot seat for hours, watching the stars and occasionally asking questions that showed a sharp intelligence and curiosity that her ordeal hadn't managed to crush. When they finally emerged in the Kalos system, what they saw was both hopeful and daunting. The planet was harsh, a desert world with fierce storms visible even from orbit, its surface scoured by winds that could strip flesh from bone. But there, clinging to the equatorial regions where the storms were slightly less deadly, were the unmistakable signs of habitation. Domes, wind farms, the geometric patterns of irrigated fields carved from hostile sand. "They survived," Baronini breathed, something like wonder in her voice. "The colony survived." Christian began the descent carefully, noting the landing instructions being broadcast on standard frequencies and the defensive weapon emplacements that tracked their approach. Someone down there was organized and cautious, which was good. It meant they'd survived this long by being smart rather than just lucky. Landing required navigating through a sandstorm that battered the Sierra's hull and threatened to tear her apart. Christian flew by instruments alone, his attention split between the displays and the controls, trusting his instincts when the instruments contradicted each other or simply failed under the storm's electromagnetic interference. They touched down hard in a designated landing zone, the Sierra settling with a groan of protesting metal and a shriek from landing gear that probably shouldn't have held but somehow did. Christian powered down and raised his hands where they could be seen through the viewport, knowing that armed colonists would already be approaching through the storm. "Let me do the talking," he said. The colony's security chief was a grizzled human, named Marcus, his face a map of scars, and his eyes holding the hard knowledge of someone who had seen too much death. He met them at the airlock with a rifle and 6 armed colonists, their weapons trained on the Sierra's exit with professional competence. "State your business," Marcus demanded, his voice carrying clearly over the howl of the wind. Baronini stepped forward, holding Alicia's hand, her dignity intact despite her worn clothing and obvious exhaustion. "Sanctuary," she said simply. "We're refugees from Arella. The Helix Consortium is hunting us. We were told this colony might offer shelter to those with nowhere else to go." Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied them, his gaze lingering on Alicia before moving to Christian. "Arella fell 6 months ago. Every refugee we've taken since then has brought trouble with them, either in the form of trauma that makes them liabilities or hunters that follow them here. We've lost good people because we were too trusting. So tell me why you should be different. Tell me why I should risk my colony for 3 strangers." Christian met his gaze steadily, recognizing a fellow survivor when he saw one. "Because we don't have anywhere else to go," he said flatly, "and because whether we're here or not, if Helix decides your colony is worth attention, they'll come anyway. At least with us here, you'll know they're coming. We can help you prepare, help you fight. I've got skills that might be useful." "Skills?" Marcus repeated, his tone skeptical. "What kind of skills?" "The kind you learned growing up in the Argonne criminal territories. The kind that kept us alive through 2 hunter teams and a military interdiction. The kind that mean I can fight, fix things, and stay alive when everything says I should be dead." Marcus studied Christian for a long moment, then looked at Baronini and Alicia again. When he spoke, his voice had softened slightly, though his weapon never wavered. "1 week. You get 1 week to prove you're worth the risk. Any sign of trouble, any indication you've brought hunters down on us, and you're gone. Understand?" "Understood," Christian agreed. The colony was a testament to human stubbornness and ingenuity. Built in one of the harshest environments Christian had ever seen, it survived through careful resource management, clever engineering, and the kind of cooperation that only emerged when everyone understood that failure meant death for all of them. The population was mixed, humans and blue-skinned refugees like Baronini, plus a handful of other species, all working together to coax life from sand and rock and the precious underground water reserves that made survival possible. Everyone had a job, everyone contributed, and those who couldn't or wouldn't pull their weight didn't last long. They were given quarters in a hab unit on the colony's edge, a metal box with 2 bunks, a water tap that worked sporadically, and walls thin enough that the wind could be heard howling outside, even through the insulation. But after days in space and the desperate flight from Arella, it felt like luxury. Christian immediately set about making himself useful. The colony's water recyclers were old and failing, cobbled together from parts scavenged from a dozen different systems and held together with improvisation and prayer. He spent 2 solid days taking them apart, learning how they'd been modified, then rebuilding them with better flow patterns and more efficient filtration. When he was done, the recycler's output had increased by 20%, and the chronic water shortage that had plagued the colony eased noticeably. Marcus watched him work, saying nothing but taking note of everything, evaluating whether this stranger might be an asset or a threat. Baronini found her place among the colony's administrators and coordinators, her diplomatic training proving invaluable in resolving disputes and organizing the chaotic web of work assignments and resource distribution. She had a gift for reading people and situations, for finding compromises that left everyone feeling heard if not entirely satisfied. Alicia, remarkably, made friends with the other children almost immediately. Despite everything she'd been through, or perhaps because of it, she understood the importance of community and connection. Christian would watch her playing with the other kids, her laughter rising above the wind, and feel that strange twist in his chest again. That emotion that might have been hope, or might have been something more dangerous. The trouble came on their 4th day, arriving with the suddenness of desert lightning. Raiders, drawn by news of the colony's successful harvest, and desperate enough to risk attacking a defended settlement, hit the water storage facility with a force of nearly 30 armed fighters. Christian heard the alarms and ran, not thinking, just reacting with the instincts of someone who had spent his life in violent places. He grabbed a rifle from the armory without asking permission and sprinted toward the sound of weapons fire, his mind already processing tactics and options. He reached the storage facility to find the colonists pinned down behind insufficient cover, outnumbered and taking casualties. The raiders had the advantage of position and firepower, and it was only a matter of time before they overran the defenders. Christian didn't announce himself or wait for orders. He simply moved, using the colony's defensive walls and the blowing sand as cover, working his way around to flank the raiders' position. He took out 3 of them with precise rifle shots before they even knew he was there, each target dropping with a neat hole burned through something vital. The rest of the raiders turned to face this new threat, which was exactly what Christian wanted. With their attention divided, the colonists rallied, pushing back with renewed determination. The fight was brief but brutal, close-range violence in the blowing sand where visibility was measured in meters, and death could come from any direction. When it was over, 8 raiders lay dead, and the rest had fled into the desert, probably to die in the storm, but that wasn't Christian's concern. He stood among the bodies, breathing hard, his rifle still warm from firing, covered in sand and blood and feeling the familiar post-combat mixture of exhaustion and relief. Marcus approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Christian thought he might actually shoot, might decide that someone as comfortable with violence as Christian had just proven himself to be was too dangerous to keep around. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "That was well done," Marcus said simply. "You could have stayed safe in your quarters. This wasn't your fight." Christian shook his hand, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Acceptance. "Water's life out here," he replied. "Had to protect it. Besides, I've never been good at staying out of fights." Something changed after that. The colonists stopped looking at Christian, Berenini, and Aliciama as temporary refugees and started treating them as part of the community. They were given better quarters, included in planning meetings, asked their opinions on matters of defense and resource management. They'd proven themselves in the way that mattered most in a place like this, by risking themselves for the collective good. The days fell into a rhythm. Christian trained with the defense force, sharing his knowledge of tactics and close quarters combat. Berenini mediated disputes and helped plan the colony's expansion into new agricultural areas. Aliciama went to the makeshift school and played with her friends, and slowly began to heal from the trauma of watching her world end. And slowly, carefully, like 2 injured animals learning to trust again, Christian and Berenini built something between them that was more than just shared danger. It started with small things, a touch that lingered slightly too long, a smile exchanged across a crowded room, conversations that stretched late into the night while Aliciama slept. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the desert and painted the sand in silver light, Berenini found Christian standing outside the colony's perimeter, staring at the stars with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible problem. "Thinking about leaving?" she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him. Christian didn't look at her, but he felt acutely aware of her presence, of the warmth of her body in the cool night air. "Thinking about staying," he admitted, "which is scarier, honestly." "Why scary?" He turned to face her then, and in the moonlight he could see the concern in her eyes, the genuine care. "Because every time I've tried to be part of something, tried to settle somewhere and build a life, it's all gone wrong. People I care about end up dead. Places I start to think of as home end up destroyed. I'm like a curse. Berenini, everything I touch eventually burns." She reached out and took his hand, her blue-tinted skin warm against his. "Or maybe you've just been alone so long you've forgotten how to see yourself clearly. You're not a curse, Christian. You're the man who saved my daughter's life. You're the man who risked everything to help strangers. You're the man this colony depends on to help keep them safe. That's not a curse. That's a blessing if you'd let yourself see it." Christian wanted to believe her, wanted to let himself imagine a future where he wasn't alone, where he had something worth staying for. But years of conditioning and pain made it hard. "Berenini, I don't know how to do this. How to be part of something. How to care about people without waiting for them to die or leave. I'm good at surviving and fighting and fixing broken things, but I'm terrible at everything else. She smiled and it transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter despite everything she'd endured. Then you'll learn. We'll learn together. Because Christian, whether you want to admit it or not, you're already part of our family. You have been since the moment you stepped between us and those mercenaries on Arella. The only question is whether you're willing to stop running and accept it. Before Christian could respond, before he could figure out how to voice the confusion of emotions churning inside him, alarms shrieked across the colony. Emergency lights blazed to life, and Marcus's voice crackled over the public address system with urgent authority. All hands to defensive positions. Helix fleet inbound. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Christian's head snapped up, and his eyes found the sky. There, descending through the atmosphere with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche, were ships. Not just a few, but a full assault flotilla. At least 12 vessels, including what looked like a command carrier. The hunters had found them, and this time, they'd brought overwhelming force. The council met in the operations center, faces grim and voices tight with tension, as they assessed the situation that everyone knew was probably hopeless. The tactical displays painted a picture of massive force disparity. The colony had perhaps 200 people capable of fighting, armed with rifles and improvised weapons, facing a professional military force of at least 1,000 soldiers with air support and heavy weapons. We can't fight that, one counselor said flatly, voicing what everyone was thinking. We need to evacuate, scatter into the desert, try to outlast them. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. To where? There's nowhere to run. If we scatter into the desert without supplies or shelter, the environment will kill us before Helix does. At least here we have infrastructure, defensible positions, water. Then we surrender, another voice suggested, though the speaker sounded like he was choking on the words. Maybe we can negotiate, trade Berenini and her daughter for the rest of us. No, Berenini's voice cut through the arguments like a knife. Helix doesn't take prisoners, not from my people, and they don't honor agreements with those who shelter us. If you surrender, they'll execute everyone who helped us. They'll make an example of this colony to discourage others from offering refuge. That's how they work. That's why they're here in such force, to send a message. Christian had been studying the tactical display in silence, his mind working through options and discarding them as fast as they formed. They couldn't win a direct confrontation. They couldn't run. They couldn't surrender, which left only one real option. Make victory so costly that Helix would decide it wasn't worth continuing. We don't need to win, he said slowly, and all eyes turned to him. We just need to make them bleed enough that they decide to look for easier targets. Explain, Marcus demanded. Christian moved to the geological survey maps displayed on another screen, his finger tracing features of the terrain. Look at this. The canyon systems, the unstable sand formations, the underground water channels. This planet's been trying to kill us since we got here. What if we make it try to kill them instead? Marcus leaned forward, interest kindling in his eyes. Ambush tactics, guerrilla warfare. More than that, Christian said, warming to the idea as it took shape. We use the canyons to channel their ground forces into killing zones, then collapse the walls on them. We contaminate the water sources they'll need for extended operations. We hit their supply lines, their communications, their vehicle parks. We make every meter they advance cost them blood and equipment and morale. Eventually, someone back in their high command is going to look at the casualty reports and resource expenditure and decide that one refugee in a desert colony aren't worth this much effort. People will die, Berenini said quietly. Our people, colonists who've already survived so much. We'll be asking them to risk everything on a strategy that might not work. People will definitely die if we do nothing, Christian replied, his voice hard. At least this way, some of us might survive. And maybe, just maybe, we bloody their nose badly enough that other colonies hear about it and get inspired to resist instead of just rolling over. The debate raged for another hour, voices rising and falling as fear warred with determination. But in the end, there was no better option. They began preparations for a defense that would turn the planet itself into their weapon against the invaders. The Helix forces landed with overwhelming strength, their dropships disgorging troops and equipment in a secure zone they'd established 10 kilometers north of the colony. Their commander, a cold-eyed strategist named Commander Valen, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had preceded him, set up a forward base and began methodical reconnaissance of the terrain and enemy positions. Christian led the first strike team 24 hours after the initial landing, a group of 30 colonists armed with rifles, improvised explosives, the desperate determination of people defending their homes. They hit a supply convoy in the deep canyons east of the Helix base, using charges made from mining explosives to trigger rock slides that buried half the convoy and cut the survivors off from support. The fighting was vicious and intimate, close-range violence in narrow spaces where superior numbers and equipment meant less than speed and knowledge of the terrain. Christian moved through the chaos like a ghost, every shot counting, every movement calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. When a Helix trooper came around a boulder, weapon raised, Christian was there with a knife, moving inside the man's guard and striking with lethal precision before disappearing back into the rocks. The strike team withdrew before reinforcements arrived, melting back into the canyon system like smoke, leaving behind destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers, and a commander who was beginning to realize this wasn't going to be the easy pacification mission he'd been promised. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with brutal consistency. The colonists fought not as soldiers, but as survivors, using every advantage the harsh planet offered. They struck from ambush and faded before counterattacks could form. They poisoned water sources with compounds that wouldn't kill, but would sicken, forcing the enemy to rely on supplies shipped from orbit. They used sandstorms as cover for raids on the Helix base perimeter, hitting fuel depots and communication arrays before disappearing into the blowing dust. Baronini coordinated the defense from the colony's operations center, her diplomatic skills perfectly suited for keeping the scattered resistance cells connected and informed, despite the Helix force's attempts to jam communications. She worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, driving herself to exhaustion because if she stopped, if she let herself think about the cost of all this violence, she might break. Aliciama and the other children stayed in the deep shelters, underground spaces that had been intended as storm refuges, but now served as protection against orbital bombardment. Christian saw the fear in his adopted daughter's eyes every time he left for another raid, heard her whispered plea for him to come back, and made promises he wasn't sure he could keep because the only thing worse than lying would be admitting he might not return. The Helix forces adapted to the resistance tactics, becoming more cautious and methodical. Commander Velen was no fool. He recognized the trap he was in and adjusted his approach, trading speed for security, accepting the slow pace of advance in exchange for minimizing casualties. But every day the operation continued was a day the consortium was spending resources on a single planet in a single target. And Christian knew that eventually someone in the high command would start asking hard questions about cost-benefit ratios. The decisive battle came when Valen, tired of the grinding attrition and under pressure from his superiors to achieve results, committed his main force to a push through the central canyon system. It was a calculated risk. The canyons offered the most direct route to the colony, but they were also obvious ambush sites. Valen gambled that his superior firepower and the discipline of his troops would allow them to fight through whatever resistance they encountered. He was wrong. Christian and Marcus stood on a canyon rim 200 meters above the valley floor, watching the enemy column advance below with the terrible magnificence of overwhelming force. It was impressive, terrifying, and under normal circumstances, it would have been unstoppable. Hundreds of troops in powered armor, vehicle-mounted weapons, air support on call, all moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers executing a well-planned operation. "This is it," Marcus said quietly, and it wasn't clear if he was stating a fact or offering a prayer. "If this doesn't work, if we can't stop them here, they'll reach the colony in hours and it's all over." Christian didn't respond immediately. He was counting, timing, calculating distances and blast radii and the million small factors that would determine whether they all lived or died in the next few minutes. They'd spent 2 weeks preparing this trap, placing charges throughout the canyon walls with painstaking precision, redirecting underground water channels to undermine the canyon floor, identifying every natural instability in the rock, and figuring out how to exploit it. The enemy column stretched for nearly a kilometer, a long mechanical snake of death winding through the canyon. Christian waited, watching, feeling the weight of hundreds of lives depending on his judgment and timing. Too soon and the trap would be incomplete. Too late and the column would pass through before they could spring it. Now, he said quietly into the radio, and his voice carried no emotion because emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. The world exploded. Charges detonated in carefully orchestrated sequence, bringing down thousands of tons of rock in cascading avalanche. The canyon walls collapsed inward, burying the middle section of the enemy column instantly. Water surged from the ruptured underground channels, turning the canyon floor into a churning river of mud and debris that swept soldiers and vehicles away like toys. Secondary charges cut off the escape routes, trapping the front and rear of the column between walls of fallen rock and rising water. Troops at both ends tried to retreat or advance, tried to find some way through the chaos, but Christian had planned for that too. Colonist fighters hidden in side canyons opened fire from elevated positions, rifles barking, grenades arcing through the air. Every shot aimed with the desperate precision of people who knew they had no ammunition to waste. Christian led a charge down the canyon side, rifle in hand, moving through the destruction with a cold clarity that came from years of survival in violent places. He picked targets, fired, moved, fired again, each action flowing into the next with mechanical efficiency. Men died on both sides, the desert sand drinking their blood without discrimination or judgment. The battle lasted 4 hours, 4 hours of sustained violence that transformed the canyon into an abattoir. When it finally ended, when the last surviving Helix soldiers had either died or fled into the desert, the canyon floor was choked with bodies and wreckage. The assault force that was supposed to take the colony had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Out of nearly 800 soldiers who had entered the canyon, fewer than 100 made it out alive. Commander Valen's command ship, hovering at a safe distance above the carnage, observed the disaster unfolding below and made a cold calculation. He'd lost 2/3 of his ground forces, multiple vehicles, and the element of surprise. The colonists had proven far more capable and determined than intelligence had suggested. Continuing the operation would require calling in additional forces, which would mean explaining to his superiors why a simple pacification mission had turned into a major military campaign. The political cost of that conversation outweighed the value of one refugee, no matter how symbolically important she might be. The Helix fleet withdrew within 24 hours, leaving their dead behind because recovering them would have required committing more forces and accepting more risk. The colonists had won, but the price was steep and painful. 32 colonists killed in the fighting, twice that number wounded, some so badly they'd never fully recover. The colony's infrastructure was damaged, supplies depleted to critical levels, water reserves lowered dangerously. But they had survived. They had stood against overwhelming force and won. And news of that victory would spread, carried by refugees and traders to other colonies, other resistance cells, other people living under occupation who needed to hear that fighting back was possible. Christian sat on a rock outside the colony as the wounded were brought in, watching the medical teams work with exhausted efficiency. He was covered in dust and blood, his own and others, and every muscle in his body screamed with fatigue. He'd taken a round that had cracked a rib, and his shoulder throbbed where he'd dislocated it, hauling a wounded colonist to safety, but he was alive. Baronini found him there as the twin moons rose over the battlefield, painting the desert in shades of silver and shadow. She looked as exhausted as he felt, her clothes stained, her hair disheveled. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Pride, maybe, or relief, or recognition that they'd achieved something that had seemed impossible. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the makeshift bandage wrapped around his ribs. "I'll live. It's not as bad as it looks." "Christian," he looked up at her, seeing his own exhaustion reflected in her face. But there was something else there too, something that made his chest tighten with emotions he still didn't have names for. When this started, he said slowly, forcing the words out past years of conditioning that told him emotions were weakness. I told myself I was just helping you escape, getting you and Elysiama away from immediate danger, then moving on like I always do. Then I told myself I was just getting you to safety, to this colony, and then I'd leave. He paused, gathering courage. Then I told myself I was just fighting to protect the colony, to defend the people here, and once the threat passed, I'd go back to drifting. But that's not true, is it? None of it is true. What is true? Baronini asked softly, and he could hear the hope in her voice, fragile and precious. That I'm tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of pretending I don't care about anything or anyone, because caring hurts too much. I care about you, Baronini, about Elysiama, about this place and these people. I don't know how to do this, how to be part of a family or a community. But I want to try, if you'll let me, if you'll have me. Baronini smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look young and light despite the weight of everything they'd endured. Then try, she said simply, and took his hand in hers. We'll figure it out together, because you're already family, Christian. You have been for a long time. You just needed to admit it to yourself. Elysiama came running out of the medical shelter, her face lighting up with relief and joy when she saw Christian. He caught her as she launched herself at him, ignoring the pain in his ribs because some things were more important than pain. You came back, she said fiercely, her small arms wrapped around his neck in a grip that threatened to strangle him. You always come back. Yeah, kid, Christian said, his voice rough with emotions he'd spent years trying to suppress. I always will. I promise.